The Hypnobirthing Toolkit is a complete hypnobirthing and birth preparation course helping you to go into the birth of your baby with confidence and positivity. It's completely self-paced with pre-recorded videos, presentations, audios, PDFs, plus monthly live classes. It's a more affordable and flexible way to learn hypnobirthing and help you have the positive birth experience you deserve. Follow the link in the description below to begin your positive birth journey today. Hello and welcome to the Bell Mama Hypnobirthing and Positive Birth podcast. My name is Ellie Waddington. I'm a hypnobirthing teacher, antenatal instructor and positive birth coach, and I'm here to help you go into the birth of your baby with a positive mindset. Every week I share my top tips, advice and amazing birth stories to help you go from fearful and anxious about your birth to positive and confident. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and let's get into this episode. Hey gorgeous mama, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I am your host Ellie Waddington and I am here to help you have an amazing birth experience. If you're new here, welcome. I'm really glad that you found us. If you're not new here, welcome back. I am really happy that you're back. Now this week I am joined by NHS Midwife Laura Green, who's talking to us all about VBACs. VBAC stands for Vaginal Birth After Caesarean, and this is a really great topic to get really stuck into because often women who have had previous caesareans, they may not realise that there are options open to them. So if you are curious about a VBAC, if you're currently pregnant with your second baby after having a previous caesarean and you're curious about a VBAC, or if you're definitely planning a VBAC, sit down and listen to this episode, get a notepad and a pen, and have a really good listen to this episode. There's so much great information from Laura, and yeah, let's get into it. Hi Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. If you would just tell me a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Thank you for having me on. So I am Laura Green. I am a midwife in the NHS in the Northwest, and I have been a community midwife. I've been a midwife for over 10 years, and I also run the Instagram account, The Green Midwife, and I'm a trained hypnobirthing and antenatal teacher as well. So when I have time, I also do some private teaching and run some courses and things online. But my day job is a midwife.
Wow. And do you have a favourite part? All those different things that you do, do you have a favourite thing that you love doing?
I think for me, the reason I'm a community midwife is because I love the continuity. So when you get to experience, we don't always get kind of proper continuity because of challenges within the NHS, but getting to know a family from the beginning of their pregnancy, seeing them throughout, and then whether you're there for the birth or not, if you are there for the birth, then that's really special. There's something amazing about looking after someone that you know well in labour. That's my absolute favourite. And then seeing them postnatally and discharging them when their baby's 3 or 4 weeks old, and you've now known this family for kind of 9 months, and for me that's really special, and building that relationship, and that's what makes the job worth it. And yes, there are challenges, but it's that's so rewarding. So I love that.
Oh, I love that. That sounds so lovely. You can tell that you're really passionate about what you do.
Yes.
So we're here today to talk about VBAC, which is a massive topic, and we're going to try and get sort of as much detail as we possibly can into this short podcast episode, but it's something that we could probably talk forever on.
Yeah.
But we'll see what we can do in this podcast episode. So first off, would you please tell us exactly what do we mean by VBAC?
Yeah, so VBAC stands for Vaginal Birth After Caesarean, and some people will just refer to like birth after caesarean. Often if you're given like a leaflet, if you've had a previous caesarean before, you might be given a leaflet about your birth choices after caesarean. But VBAC specifically refers to vaginal birth after caesarean. And so if you have previously had a caesarean and you're now pregnant again, then you will have that kind of decision to make in terms of, am I planning a repeat caesarean? So am I planning an elective caesarean, or am I planning to have a vaginal birth in this pregnancy?
And it's always an option, isn't it? It's always a choice. And I think the reason that it's important that we have these conversations is that sometimes women can feel like they're being guided towards a particular course of action and they don't feel like they have a choice.
Yeah. So in It should be presented as a choice. There are very few reasons where someone would be told, no, we absolutely don't recommend a vaginal birth for you. And often those reasons are not necessarily to do with having had a previous cesarean. They might be a complication in the current pregnancy. So something like placenta previa, where you're going to be recommended a cesarean anyway. There are a very tiny percentage of women that, due to complications with the first cesarean or the type of incision, that it is deemed more risky to have a vaginal birth after cesarean. But for the vast majority of people, yes, absolutely, you'll very much get the choice, and it should be presented as that. I think, as you say, sometimes it can come across as, oh, you could do that, but it would be much easier. You know, there's a clear preference from the care providers about what type of birth they think you should have, but actually it's not their birth, it's not their baby, and our job as healthcare professionals is to provide that information in a balanced way without bias, so that you can make the decision about what is best for you and your baby.
Absolutely amazing. You mentioned there, you know, in some situations it may be deemed more risky. So what is the risk associated with VBAC? What reason might your healthcare professional not want you to give birth vaginally after a cesarean?
So the main thing that people think about with VBAC is the risk or the chance of uterine rupture. So uterine rupture is really considered the kind of risk that doesn't particularly exist with other vaginal births. So the other kind of risks, in inverted commas, of VBAC also apply to any vaginal birth, but uterine rupture, you can actually experience a uterine rupture when you've not previously had a cesarean or got a scar in your uterus, but it's less likely. But the kind of thing that is different for VBAC is the chance of uterine rupture. So uterine rupture is when the scar tissue from your previous cesarean opens and ruptures, essentially. So either partially separates, or more commonly, all three layers of the incision open, and you have what we call a complete rupture. And that is that's one of the risks of vaginal birth after cesarean, because when you go into labour, then we know that by having contractions, that increases that pressure within the uterus, and it's not common, but very occasionally the kind of stress that labour puts on your body and on your uterus can cause that previous scar to open, and that is an emergency situation.
And what is the likelihood of that happening? Obviously, we talk a lot about risk, and I think there is often a tendency with some healthcare professionals where they say it's more risky or the risk increases. But, you know, as a birth worker myself, and I'm sure you agree, it's important that the women we're working with know what those numbers are, because saying something is more risky doesn't mean anything at all unless you have those exact numbers. So if you have had a previous cesarean and you go into labour spontaneously, what is the risk of uterine rupture?
So overall, the rate is quoted at 0.5%. So that means that 99.5% of women will not experience a uterine rupture. That's what's quoted in the RCOG guidance. However, it does vary slightly depending on the type of birth and things. And we do actually have a newer, so that RCOG guidance is a few years old now, and there's actually been a newer large study which looked at over 2.5 million births, and they found that actually the overall rate of uterine rupture was 0.22%. So therefore, just under 99.8% of women won't experience uterine rupture. Not all of the studies break it down by whether you go into spontaneous labour or not, so those are kind of combined, but we do know that having your labour induced or augmented, so that's sped up, so you might be that your waters are broken and then you go in and have a oxytocin drip, or it might be that you're in labour and then they say, oh, your contractions have slowed down too much, and they offer you a drip to speed it up. That increases the risk of uterine rupture to around about 1%. Just under 1% for induced labour and just over 1% for augmented labour. So that is that's a conversation that you need to have if you're thinking about. It's one of the choices that I always recommend people to think about when they're planning for a VBAC, is that would you accept an induction of labour? Is that something, when we talk about the kind of enhanced risk with that. However, on the flip side, that's still a 99% chance that you won't experience uterine rupture, and there are lots of people that have an induced labour and still have a successful VBAC. So it doesn't mean that you can't do that. Your chance will be lowest if you go into spontaneous labour, but yeah, it's an absolute small. The absolute risk still remains small.
Yeah, and I think that right there is why it's so important that we do know these numbers, because to me, like, I was quite shocked by that, because when people talk about VBACs, it sounds like you're at quite a high risk of uterine rupture, but 0.22% to me personally, that sounds like quite a low risk.
Yeah.
If I had a 99.8% chance that I was going to win a bet on a sports match, then I'm going to mortgage my entire house and bet that on it. That's pretty much a guaranteed win. But to someone else, to someone else, that kind of 0.2%, that might seem too high.
Yes.
And that's why you've got to know these figures yourself, so you can make those individual decisions yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And it's looking at that absolute risk rather than that relative risk. So what is the actual number, rather than, as you say, oh, that's dangerous, or oh, isn't that risky, or this increases your risk 10 times. Okay, well, that doesn't mean anything. You need to have some numbers behind that. I also think that so uterine rupture is an emergency situation, but it is often painted as you and your baby are going to die if this happens, and that just isn't the case, especially in a well-resourced healthcare setting. I say well-resourced, rolling my eyes, but comparatively, with access to hospitals, with access to theatres, then actually the morbidity and the mortality from uterine rupture is low. So 9 out of 10 babies who experience a complete uterine rupture will survive, and the rate of maternal death is absolutely minuscule. It's something like 0.002%. Yes, I was right, 0.02%. And so it often is presented as this is the worst case scenario, but actually it's useful to know. Some people are like, I don't want to think about it at all, but for other people that information is empowering, and actually it's good to know that the likely scenario, even if you were to experience a uterine rupture, is that you and your baby will be well. Yes, you'll have an emergency cesarean because they'll rush you down to theatre, but actually we're very skilled, and we are really lucky that we have those resources available when we need them. And yeah, the most likely scenario is that you and your baby will be well.
Oh, that's really reassuring. That's because, as I said, going into this conversation, I was there thinking that the statistics are going to be much higher, but actually knowing that's a really kind of reassuring thing to know. Just one point though, you touched upon maternal and baby deaths. Is there any statistics for kind of long-term major consequences from uterine rupture, so hysterectomy or anything like that?
Yeah, so we do know that there are risks with uterine rupture. So about 21% of women would need blood transfusions. About 20% of the women were admitted to intensive care. About 10% had a hysterectomy, and about 7.7% of babies had a hypoxia, so a lack of oxygen at birth. So it is, as I said, it is an emergency situation, but we are also talking about less than 0.5% chance that this will happen. So I don't want to skirt around. I think we need to be responsible in the way that we share information. And I'm not going to sit here and say to you there are no risks with VBAC, the same as I can't say that for any type of birth. All birth inherently carries some risk, and we know that, and it's just about putting some kind of numbers behind that, and looking at that and looking at the bigger picture, really.
Sometimes people, when they when they want a VBAC, if that's something that they want to do, they may come up against certain challenges, certain hurdles within their care. It's a complete kind of postcode lottery. You'll find that you have different policies, different hospitals, different trusts. What are some of the challenges that you may face? What are some of the hurdles? Are there any kind of limitations that your healthcare professional may put on your birth? Are there any things they may say, we don't recommend you do that. We don't advise that you do this?
Yeah. So overall, the rate of, I don't really like the term successful VBAC because it implies that if you don't get a vaginal birth that you failed, which is absolutely not right. But the women who plan a VBAC who go on to have a vaginal birth, again, the RCOG guidance says that that's 72 to 75% chance, so 3 out of 4 women. However, we know that in reality, sometimes the local rates are lower than that. So one of the challenges can be that actually if the hospital culture isn't particularly supportive of VBAC, then it might be that you face more, it's not as encouraged or supported. Now, it can be quite difficult to find that statistic out. It's not always something that is published on within hospital data, but it's certainly worth, if you're thinking about planning a VBAC, then it's certainly worth asking at the hospital, because there will be someone that can find that. They should record it. They might just not necessarily publish it freely. So if that's important for you, if you know at one hospital they have a 45% VBAC rate and the hospital down the road has a 70% VBAC rate, then actually that might sway your decision about where you go for your care, for example. So asking for that information. If the midwife or the doctor can't provide that, then you can also put a freedom of information request in, and they have 20 days to respond to that. But yeah, that can be useful to know, just to give you a little bit of background about actually what's, that gives you an idea as to how supportive the hospital or the trust are in general. There are other things as well in terms of the care that will be recommended to you. So generally, standard hospital policy when you are having a VBAC, so your pregnancy shouldn't really differ. You often will be booked an appointment with an obstetrician at 36 weeks, potentially early in your pregnancy, and you may go to a birth options clinic or a VBAC clinic around about 20 weeks, and then you'd usually be booked with an obstetrician to have a kind of discussion to decide on mode of birth at around 36 weeks. But apart from that, your pregnancy care shouldn't really differ. In terms of birth, there are often things that are a little bit different than if you were having, say, for example, your first baby vaginally. So most hospitals will have a policy of recommending that you give birth on a obstetric-led unit, so on a labour ward, with continuous fetal monitoring. So that's monitoring of the baby's heart rate all of the time. It used to be that they also recommended having a cannula, so a drip in your hand in case they needed to get access to your vein very quickly, but that has actually been taken out of national recommendations. So that kind of depends on the policy of the local hospital, but it's no longer in national guidance. And in terms of pain relief, again, it used to be that they would say, oh no, you can't have a water birth, and that has now been taken out of national guidance, and it says that women experiencing VBAC should have access to water. I think in reality, because of the recommendation to have continuous monitoring, less women experience water birth when they're having a VBAC, because of the kind of some of the logistical challenges that come with monitoring baby and water and the confidence of the staff and things. And that's a slightly, that's it depends on the area, but those are things that may be a little bit different, and it will often be written kind of high risk across your notes as well, which can be quite confronting for you if you've had a really straightforward pregnancy and just happened to have a cesarean last time, and you're otherwise well, then that can feel it can kind of undermine that confidence a little bit and makes you question yourself because suddenly you've got this big risk sticker all over your notes.
Yeah, the high risk sticker. That is something I do have a problem with, because often it's the mindset that you receive from receiving a high risk label that actually causes more problems than the thing that is deemed to be a risk.
Yeah.
But again, that's a whole different conversation.
Yes.
So if someone were having a VBAC and they were in a trust where they were told they're being told that they're not allowed a water birth, I say not allowed in inverted commas, what could they do about that? What's the advice that you give someone that would very much like a water birth, but they're being told they can't in regards to a VBAC?
Yeah. So you've got two options really. So you can ask if there is wireless monitoring. So if you have thought about your options for monitoring of baby's heart rate and labour and decided that, yeah, actually I'd feel more comfortable with continuous monitoring, or I don't want to kind of go against guidance, I'm happy to accept that, then you can ask for telemetry, which is wireless CTG monitoring. So that's continuous monitoring of the baby's heart rate, but you're not attached to the CTG machine. It uses Bluetooth, I think, to be able to allow you more movement. So you have there's still the two monitors on, one to monitor contractions, one to monitor baby's heart rate, and most telemetry machines are waterproof. Most hospitals should have at least one wireless CTG monitor, hopefully more than that. They need to make sure that it's their responsibility to make sure it's things like it's charged up. But if that's something that saying to your midwife beforehand, saying when you turn up to the hospital in labour, can you make sure that the pool is free? I really want to use the water. Can you make sure that the wireless monitoring is available? And things like that, then that's one way. The other option is to choose to use a midwife-led setting for birth, such as a birth centre or home birth. So these choices, I talk about this. I have a VBAC course, and I spend quite a lot of time talking about your options in birth and what choices you can have. And one of the things we focus on is monitoring and labour. So it may be that you look at the evidence and you decide that actually, I think I'm going to decline continuous monitoring in labour, and I'd like to use a midwife-led setting such as a birth centre, and I want to have intermittent, so listening to the baby's heart rate every 15 minutes. And that means that, there should be no problem with you using water, because all the Dopplers that we use are waterproof, and we can listen to baby very easily whilst you're in and out the pool and things. Quite interestingly, when they updated the guidance, so they updated the NICE guidance, so that's our national standard of guidance that all hospital trusts base their local guidance off. When they updated that a couple of years ago, they actually removed the recommendation for continuous fetal monitoring in labour, and then lots of people kicked up a fuss. So it was when it went out as a draft proposal. Lots of hospitals and obstetricians said, no, you can't do that. And so the recommendation, they removed that from the guidance, and it now just says, please see guidance on fetal monitoring and labour. The NICE guidance for fetal monitoring and labour says that any risk factors, including having previous cesarean, means that they recommend continuous fetal monitoring. But when you dive into the research around continuous monitoring labour, we don't have any evidence to say that it improves outcomes for babies. We know that in general, and we don't have any specific data to say. The reason that it's recommended, sorry, I'm going off into a tangent about monitoring and labour now, but the reason it's recommended is because it is thought that if you were to experience a uterine rupture, that if you've got a continuous monitor on baby, that they would pick up changes in the baby's heart rate. So one of the signs of uterine rupture would be that you have a sudden and marked drop in the baby's heart rate, and sometimes you get changes before that. But there was a really interesting study, and Kristen Small on her excellent website Birth Small Talk published this, where what they did is they tested this theory by sending CTG printouts. So you get like a printout after the labour. They sent these sets of notes out to different obstetricians, and they said to them, one half of the group had experienced a uterine rupture and the other half hadn't. And they sent them out, and they asked them to categorise the CTG and the changes in it, and to identify which women experienced a uterine rupture. and they basically couldn't. So they found a high level of abnormal CTGs across both groups, and they basically said it's not a good predictor, because actually a lot of these will have changes in the heart rate, and it wasn't that you would have thought that it would be very clear to be like, oh yes, that lady hasn't had a uterine rupture, her heart rate monitoring is normal, that lady did, that was really abnormal, but it wasn't as clear as that. So that, again, that just kind of calls into question that recommendation for continuous monitoring. Now, using a midwife-led setting or declining continuous monitoring will be against guidance. So that is something that you need to think personally about. How do I feel about that? Am I going to be supported in that? Where does that support come from? Do I need to have a conversation with a consultant midwife, with a birth choices clinic, with my community midwife? Again, depending on where you are and what the support is like, that might be really easy or that might be really challenging. And there are lots of different factors that affect how you feel about that. And there is I want to recognise that it's difficult. I think a lot of the time it's like, oh, just decline this, this and this, but it's not as easy as that. And so what I say to people is, have this conversation ahead of time. You really don't want to be making these decisions when you're in labour. So if you're thinking, actually, I really want to go to the birth centre and have a VBAC in the water, brilliant, but do some prep before. Make your birth preferences really clear. Who do you need to speak to about putting that plan in place? Because if that work has been done beforehand, when you then turn up in labour, you can say, I've had this plan approved, please see my notes, and then there shouldn't be any of those discussions when you're actually just trying to get on and have a baby.
Yeah, because I know firsthand that the decisions you make beforehand, once you get into labour, your mindset, you're so suggestible to things that you wouldn't you wouldn't agree to otherwise. And it's very easy when you're in labour just to go along with things and say, oh yeah, okay. And so it's so important that you're supporting the people around you know what your decisions are, so that you're not just going to be there going, oh yeah, okay. Because this happened to me during my labour. I put on my birth plan that I didn't want a vaginal examination. But then once I was actually in labour, the midwife that's attending me said, we'd really like to just give you a vaginal examination now, and then we promise we won't give you any more. And so I was like, oh yeah, okay. And even my husband was like, but you said you didn't want one. And I was like, yeah, okay, I'll just do it. And afterwards, I was so angry with myself because I was like, I don't know why I said that. I have no idea why I said okay. Like, I knew that I didn't want one, but when you're in labour, you were just so easily led. You're so suggestible to things that you wouldn't ordinarily say yes to.
Yeah.
It's a really, really bizarre thing. But yeah, that was a completely different topic. That was a tangent. What are we talking about? So VBACs, we're talking about VBACs. So we've spoken a little bit about what a VBAC is and what the risks are and the statistics behind that. Is there something that a pregnant lady can do if she were wanting to reduce the risks of the uterine rupture, if she was wanting to reduce the risk of these things happening? Is there any preparation, anything she can do in labour to reduce those risks?
So I think probably the main thing would be avoiding induction or augmentation of labour. So as I said before, it doesn't mean that it's a complete no, but we do know that it increases the chance. The other things that the guidance talk about aren't necessarily things that you can control. So factors that affect your chance of having a VBAC are partly the reason for the previous cesarean. No, you can't change that. But it seems to be that if you've had a cesarean in labour for a labour that wasn't progressing as quickly as expected, that seems to increase the chance, rather than say, a planned cesarean for a breech baby, for example. And your BMI as well. Now, again, it's difficult to pin down exactly whether that is actually anything to do with your weight or whether it is more to do with weight bias and the type of care that people receive when they have a BMI above a certain level. So that may well just be cultural norms, and actually someone walks in and the ARCOG guidance says that if you've had a previous, it's your first vaginal birth, you've had a previous cesarean for labour dystocia, your BMI is over 30 and your labour is induced, that your chance of successful VBAC is around 40%. So it makes a big difference. But again, the BMI bit, I'm not so convinced that it's anything to do with your body's ability to birth, and I think it's much more to do with the type of care that you receive. We do also know that midwifery-led care improves vaginal birth rates overall, including with VBAC, and continuity of care seem to also increase the chance. And again, that comes with that supportive care in labour. But they've done quite a few studies looking at people's experiences and how supported they felt, and women that were cared for by a midwife felt more supported in their decisions and more supported in labour compared to women that were cared for by an obstetrician, but all by like fragmented care. They've done quite a lot of work in this in Australia, because in Australia you have lots of different types. In the UK, you know, everybody sees a midwife, and then some people see a doctor as well. But in America and in Australia, you've got private midwives, home birth midwives, you've got hospital-based programs, you've got obstetricians, you've got private obstetricians. So there's been quite a lot of work there looking at the impact of the care that you receive. We know that giving birth outside, there was a study that looked at women who planned home births, and they found that there was a 39, so this isn't particularly with uterine rupture, but in terms of the chance of achieving a vaginal birth, there was a 39% reduction in the chance of having a repeat cesarean if you were birthing at home. And that's probably to do with the supportive environment and the type of care that you receive at home. But in terms of uterine rupture, I would say it's more to do with induction or augmentation, and it is unfortunately, like a lot of emergencies, it is unfortunately one of those things. There was a bit of a query about the length, the time between births, so that the evidence is a little bit mixed. So sometimes if you have a shorter interval, so they often recommend when you've had a cesarean waiting 12 to 18 months before getting pregnant again, and that's partly to do with the healing. So if you had a cesarean 6 months ago and then you get pregnant quite quickly, then that scar has had less time to heal. So studies that have looked at it found that the lowest chance of uterine rupture was when you had between a 2 and a 10-year gap between births. In America, they sometimes will scan to see like the thickness of the scar and how well it's healed, and that is talked about in our guidance, but because we don't have enough evidence in the UK to say that it's helpful, and I suspect because it's probably expensive and we don't have the equipment to do it, that isn't part of standard care here.
Wow, okay. I didn't know that you could actually scan to see what the scar was looking like. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's not something that's done routinely here, but it is referenced there. There have been a few studies, and I know that in the US that is something that they will do.
Yeah, okay. And just touching on a point that you made a few minutes ago about you're more likely to have certain outcomes if you're in midwifery care. Is it fair to say that sometimes obstetricians are just a little bit more jumpy with regards to these things because they tend to only see emergencies?
Absolutely. I always explain to people, because often people will come to me and be like, really conflicted because they've gone and had this conversation with an obstetrician, and then they come back and have a conversation with a midwife, and they're like, you were saying totally different things. And exactly as you say, midwives are the expert in normal, and we see and support normal physiology as our kind of basis of care, and then we refer to obstetricians or other specialists if there is a deviation, if there is pathology, if there is something going wrong. So you have to imagine and respect the fact that obstetricians, and they are brilliant, and some of them are really women-centered, but particularly people that are maybe in their training and don't necessarily have that breadth of experience, and they're just going off the guidance that are in front of them. As you say, they only ever see birth when it goes wrong. They don't see people that roar a baby out at home in their living room and don't ever need need to go to hospital. They don't see people that come into the birth centre and have a VBAC, because we don't need them, so we don't call them, but they see birth that requires intervention. They see cesareans, they see assisted vaginal birth. So in their head, everyone is a disaster waiting to happen, you know, because that's what they see. And the more that you see that, we're very influenced by the culture in which we work and our experience. It's a bit like if you've had a baby before, that experience is the biggest influence on your attitude, because that's personal to you, and you think, well, I'm not doing that again because that happened to me last time. So sometimes we find that obstetricians tend to be more risk adverse, so they tend to say, oh, well, that's a bit risky, and they might downplay, for example, the risks of cesarean section, because they see that all the time and it's very routine. I think the other thing they don't always see is the medium or longer term impact. So as a midwife, we will go and see people afterwards. So from an obstetric point of view, if you walk out of that door with an alive mum and an alive baby, tick, job done. They aren't measuring the experience, the impact on your mental health, the impact on your ability to feed your baby or to bond with your baby after birth, the kind of, we know that like having an emergency cesarean labour can have impacts on people's bonding, can have impacts on their breastfeeding journey, if they choose to breastfeed, and lots of these of birth trauma, of psychological impacts. But women don't go back into maternity services. They go to their GP for their mental health, and then they might go into psychological services, or they might come back to us for a birth trauma a debrief after birth. But obstetricians don't necessarily see that longer term, and so that also, they are very much focused on the short term outcomes.
That is something that I'm quite big on, is the way that you feel about your birth. You know, coming away with a live baby and a live mum, that's bare minimum that you should expect. You know, you should come away feeling like you were listened to, like you had a positive birth experience, like you were respected, like you were treated like a human being and not like a can of Pringles, like being opened up, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And that has such an impact on the way that you go into parenthood and the confidence in yourself. And I'm not sitting here saying that everyone who has a cesarean has a negative experience. And for a lot of people, choosing to plan a cesarean the second time gives them a lot of control and a lot of power. And actually, that's a really healing and really empowering experience for them. And that is, I absolutely support that. And you've got to think about with birth, I always say we focus a lot on the physical well-being, but you've also got to think about your emotional and psychological well-being. And for some people, that's going to be choosing to go nowhere near a hospital and have your baby at home the second time. And for other people, that's going to be choosing a planned cesarean. And I don't really mind what that is. What I care about is the fact, as you say, that you feel supported and that you feel like you have that choice, and that it's and that you have that positive birth experience.
Yeah, and when we're talking about sort of cesareans and inductions, it's very easy to kind of lump them all into one and say, oh, that's a bad thing. We want to avoid that. In my experience, the families that I've worked with, the people that have had positive cesareans and positive inductions, those are the ones that went into them knowing exactly what to expect. They went into they chose those experiences and they were able to prepare for them. And where people have had negative inductions or negative cesareans, they weren't expecting it. They didn't prepare for it. It was very much kind of sprung upon them. And it's the preparation and the choices that made that difference.
Yeah, and also the way that you're looked after and the way that you're spoken to, and if you're respected and things, that has a big impact on your care as well. But absolutely, the things that you can control is that kind of birth preparation as well.
I think we just about covered all the questions that I had. We covered sort of just about everything I can think of. Can you think of anything else that we haven't covered that someone should know about VBAC?
I think that the only other thing to say is that sometimes when you're presented with the options, then cesarean can seem like the kind of risk-free option, particularly depending on who you're having that conversation with. And I think it's important that you're provided with all the information. So a lot of the time you go in and have a conversation about VBAC and it's focused almost entirely on the chance of uterine rupture, and there's absolutely no mention of the risks of cesarean section. And generally cesareans are really safe, and particularly planned cesareans, yes, great. What I do think that we need to be having conversations about is what you want to do in future. Now, it's really hard when you're having, maybe a second baby and you're thinking, and someone's saying to you, well, how many more children do you want in the future? You're like, well, I don't necessarily know. But if you are someone that knows that you want a bigger family, there are risks that come with having multiple cesareans. So first cesarean's very, very safe. Second cesarean's pretty safe. The risks go up with each one because they go in the same place. So something like placenta accreta, which is when the placenta embeds too deeply into the uterine wall. Sometimes it embeds across where your cesarean scar is, and sometimes it goes is elsewhere, but it embeds too deeply. The chance of placenta accreta goes up quite significantly with each birth, and it's often why people will say, oh, you can't have more than 3 cesareans. So the chance of placenta accreta happening after 1 cesarean is 3%, after 2 cesareans is 11%, after 3 previous cesareans goes up to around 40, and may go as high as 60% after 4 previous cesareans. And that has a significant impact on the next birth. We also know that once you've had 1 VBAC, that your chance of another successful vaginal birth goes up to about 90%. So if you say you, or conversely, if you've had a previous vaginal birth, so say you had a vaginal birth with your first, you had a cesarean with your second, and now you're facing that decision in the 3rd pregnancy, well, actually there's a 9 out of 10 chance that you'll have a straightforward vaginal birth. So it's sometimes thinking through the impact of those cesareans and just asking for that information, and making sure that actually you've got the information on both sides. So they'll get you to you sign the consent form with all this risk of infection and things, but having that information beforehand can sometimes be quite helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that nothing in birth is risk-free. Like you could have a serious outcome, literally, whoever you are, whatever your background, whatever kind of birth you're having, however many babies you're having, anything can happen for anyone. And so
it can, but also it mostly doesn't. So and most of the time, and that's the takeaway, whatever you choose, vaginal birth, cesarean, the likelihood is that you and your baby will have a safe birth. But yeah, absolutely nothing in this life is risk-free, and we all walk out our door every morning and don't worry about crossing the road and being hit by a car. But there are always background risks to life, and it's your individual perspective of risk and what is important to you. So quite often I will have conversations with people who I'll talk to them about risks and benefits, and then they'll say, yeah, that all sounds okay. I think I'd be happy to go for a vaginal birth if I went into spontaneous labour, but I really don't want to be induced, because they had a negative experience of induction. They know it increases their risk, and they'd say, well, actually, I'd rather choose a cesarean at that point. And that's another point, is that you do have those choices. You don't have to make a decision beforehand. It's useful to, and useful to have a preference, but if you come in labour and think, nope, not doing this, want a cesarean, fine, ask for a cesarean. Equally, if you if you go for an induction and you've been there for 2 or 3 days, your cervix isn't really changing, and then it's also totally fine to turn around and say, actually, no, I don't want to continue with this process, I'd like to have a cesarean now, then that's absolutely fine. So it is, you do have the power to be like, actually, I've changed my mind.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people don't realize either, is that if you agree to something, that's not set in stone. Like, obviously there are some like permanent things that can't be undone, like having your waters broken or whatever.
Yeah.
But at any point you can say, actually, no, I've changed my mind, I don't want this anymore. Yeah. And on the reverse, you can actually say, oh, I know I said I didn't want this, but actually I've decided I do want this.
Usually a planned cesarean would be at 39 weeks, but it's also okay to be like, you know what, I don't want one at 39 weeks, but I don't really want to go overdue, so I'd be happy to have one at 40 weeks or at 41 weeks. And if I've not gone into spontaneous labour at that point, then that's going to be my choice. And it's really useful in your antenatal time to be able to plan for that, and to have that kind of plan A, but to also have your plan B and your plan C, so that if we're in this situation, I know what my preferences are, I know what things I want out of that cesarean, and whether that's a gentle cesarean or delayed cord clamping, whatever those are, that you've got those, that you've thought that through, and that can really help you prepare.
What do you think is the biggest reason that people don't assert themselves? What is the reason that someone is, sometimes a little bit too nervous to say, I want this? What do you think is the biggest reason for that?
I think it's cultural. I think we are all conditioned by society to think that doctors know best, and oh well, who am I to argue with that because I don't know anything, and that lack of trust in our own bodies and our own intuition, that starts really young, that starts in childhood, and suddenly it comes to having a baby, and you've not listened to your body for your entire life, and whenever you need a wee you think no, I'll just ignore it, I'm too busy, can't go for a wee, and then suddenly it's like, oh, I've got to take this autonomy and make these decisions. And there is also fear. Almost everyone, their most important thing, they just say, I just want the baby to be safe. Women and mothers are inherently selfless, and it's like, actually I just need to protect the baby. So I think it's fear, and it's cultural, and that's why it isn't, it's all very well saying, yeah, you can do this, and you make all the choices, and you can say no to whatever you want, but we also recognize that that's really difficult to do, and in order to do that you need to kind of have a strong will and really good support as well. And that's where something like excellent antenatal education, or having a really brilliant hypnobirthing teacher, or a doula, can be amazingly helpful in helping that you advocate for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think talking to some of the ladies that I work with, a phrase that I hear quite a lot is, I could never live with myself if this happened. I'd feel so guilty if this happened. And I almost think the guilt of being responsible for that decision is kind of, that weighs greater than the actual outcome, if that makes sense. It's the thought that they could be blamed, that someone could said, oh, if you'd have gone to the hospital, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of blame culture within hospitals as well, and there's not supposed to be. All the reports say that we shouldn't have a blame culture, but we still sadly do, and that is the same for healthcare professionals as well, which is why there's a lot of fear from our side, because actually people are terrified of having their PIN number taken away from them, their registration to practice. They're terrified of being sacked from the hospital. They're terrified of being told off because they supported someone that wasn't in line with the guidance, even though we know that guidance isn't evidence-based. But again, it's really difficult for us to step outside of that, and that will often depend on what the leadership is, and lots of different factors as well. So that kind of fear comes from both sides, I think, and that sense of responsibility.
Yeah, and I think it's really kind of useful to have a conversation with you working within the NHS, because I think as birth workers we can become quite divided, and there becomes this kind of like us and them. And so we have to remember that you guys working within the NHS, you're just people, and you're working within a system that's massively flawed. You're doing your best, but you are guided by policy.
And I'm not trying to make excuses. There are huge flaws, and I think a lot of people never look outside of the guidance and never go and off and do their kind of own, because actually when you look at the actual statistics and you look at the research behind it, so much of what we practice is absolutely not evidence-based, but that takes time and energy and effort, and our work lives are often so draining that actually at the end of the shift you just come home and collapse, and you really don't want to go off and be reading the latest research study. So that's why there's some brilliant resources. I really like the book Birth After Caesarean, Your Journey to a Better Birth by Hazel Keedle. She's fantastic. She's an Australian researcher and midwife, and she's written a really brilliant book, and it's got loads of really positive birth stories in the back as well. So there's about 10 different stories of loads of different experiences. So there's one woman who's experienced a previous uterine rupture who then went on to have a vaginal birth. There's a woman with twins. There's someone in a birth centre. There's lots of different experiences that you can connect to. So a resource like that. There's VBAC podcast. There's support groups. There's loads of stuff that people can access if they need that kind of bit of support and positivity in their pregnancy.
Yeah, and I think those stories are really, really important because you can connect with them. It's all well and good for us to sit here and say, oh, it's only a 0. whatever% chance of rupture. But actually hearing those stories and seeing actual people go through this, that resonates so much more with people's mindset.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you do a VBAC workshop. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And if someone listening would like to work with you to prepare their mindset for their VBAC, how would they do that?
Yeah, so I have two options. So yeah, I have a VBAC workshop, which is a 2-hour course where we go into a lot more detail about some of the things that I've discussed. That I really break down the evidence, and we talk about birth options, and what your choices are, where you can find support. So I have either a pre-recorded session on that, or you can occasionally I run group ones, and best place to keep an eye on my Instagram, or people can alternatively book a one-to-one. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll support families to they access the recording, and then they have a half an hour one-to-one time slot with me, just to kind of work out those questions that they have, and how does this apply to me, and can you tell me a little bit more about this? And for some people that's a really good option. I'm in the process of putting it on my website, because my website is awful, but it's all linked through my on my Instagram through my link tree. There's it's all on there, and you can access it through that. And then I also do I'm currently not running group hypnobirthing courses, but I am still offering some one-to-one. So I offer one-off birth planning sessions, where we just have that opportunity to discuss things, and then kind of longer hypnobirthing and antenatal courses. And I can, when we're doing them on a private basis, I can make that really bespoke. So I will cover whatever it is that you want to focus on. And for some people, there are lots of excellent hypnobirthing teachers out there, and it's finding someone that you align with. But for some people, I think they like the fact that I have that experience of working within the system, and I kind of it's that kind of insight into actually this is the reality of what it's like, and these are some of the challenges that you might face, and that can be helpful, kind of seeing it from both sides of the coin, really.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much, Laura. Could you please finish off with one final thought or one final piece of advice for anyone going along this journey?
Yeah, I think that it would probably be that you have choices. So you have a choice to have a VBAC or not. And if you go for a VBAC, it isn't that you have to have the birth that's prescribed, by the guidance, that actually you do still have choices, and it might be a little bit more challenging to find that support, but ultimately you're still having a baby, and you should still be supported in your choices for birth.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for having me.